Luke is not writing the Bible. Luke didn't have any idea there would ever be the Bible.
The sad thing about that sermon is he actually says several good things, and the framework he's using is very understandable, but what he just said there about Luke is wrong, and let me give you 3 reasons why. Now, these 3 points I'm going to share with you in today's video build one upon the other, so you have to wait until the end of today's video to get the full complete picture. The first reason we know this is wrong is because Luke tells us himself in his gospel account that he's writing a detailed report, not just any old document, to confirm the faith of something that's already believed. Think about the first 4 verses here in his gospel. He says, "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us." That's already key, right? That he's talking about him as part of this body. In verse 2, as you can see, he talks about the witnesses. He says, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. So these are eyewitness testimonies he's talking about here. Now notice this is the key part of verse 2. And ministers of the word. He's already talking about people who are ministers of the word already to start his gospel account. And he talks about obviously how those people delivered these messages unto them. Then in verse 3, he now highlights that he has perfect understanding of these situations, right? Because he says, it seemed good to him also, why? Having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. He's engaged with eyewitnesses. He's spoken about them being ministers of the word to start his gospel. He's talked about how he's got pristine, perfect understanding. And he says, you know what? This is so you can have certainty in verse 4, as he says, that you may have certainty concerning the things you have been taught. So now that we've built this foundation in this 3-step structure, step number 2 is going to get us really close to over the line. But step number 3 in today's video is really going to seal the deal, and you'll know why when we basically get there. But before we do that, step number 2 is vital, because it's the fact that Luke's gospel is quoted as scripture. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, for example, when Paul the apostle is speaking about the Lord's Supper, he talks about things that Jesus said, which are synonymous with Luke's gospel account from Luke chapter 22. But the even more clearer passage is in 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 18, as you can see here, where Paul says quite clearly, the scripture says. Now what Paul does here is golden, but it's very elucidating in regards to what we're speaking about today. He says, you shall not muzzle the ox that treads out the corn, right? This is an allusion to the book of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament. Funny enough, considering we're speaking about Corinthians today, this is the same passage that Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians as well. But he goes on. He says, and the laborer worthy of his reward. In one sentence, in one verse in 1 Timothy, Paul has clustered together Deuteronomy and Luke's gospel account under the guise of, yes, you got it right, scripture. Before we move to step 3, we need to talk about the dilemma that what Andy Stanley said actually presents. Because the fact of the matter is, if Luke didn't believe he's writing scripture, and this is where step 3 is going to come in a moment, the fact of the matter is, the dilemma is this: the Bible clearly says that the scriptures are inspired by God. So it puts Luke in a position. Either Luke is not inspired by God and is just an accurate piece of history, like any other history book which has accuracy in it, which we don't need to read it in that case. Or number 2, that he basically had no control, no awareness of what was going on when he was writing scripture. And he turns out to be somebody like Isaac Mendes from Heroes. That would be obviously an explanation how Paul would be quoting Luke as scripture and somehow Luke didn't know about it. But it would be very strange, if you ask me, if Luke had no awareness that he was writing scripture, or even more significantly, that Paul was quoting him as scripture. Because look at this passage, for example, in Acts chapter 20. This is an example of many examples in the last half of the book of Acts, where notice what it says. These went on ahead and were waiting for who? For us at Troas. But when we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. The point is, Luke here is including himself in these traveling journeys with the Apostle Paul. But when you think about the timeline of the book of Acts and when it was written, Corinthians was written before the book of Acts, right? So Paul had already been quoting Luke as scripture. And after that period in time, Luke is obviously still traveling around with Paul, knowing that Paul's actually doing this. This is why it's safe to say that Luke knew that he was writing scripture, and it wasn't something which was decided 300 years after the fact. This is why it's important for you to know the Bible for yourself, just like this woman found out the hard way in this video right here. What happened? God bless.